Hi, this is Peggy McGill, and I wanted to talk to you about my favorite movie of all time, the movie Up from the creators at Pixar. First of all, I just want to note that I did not use any graphics or anything like that from Pixar for copyright reasons, so you will not notice any of the traditional graphics that you've seen associated with the movie Up. But I'd like to talk to you about how in the movie Up I felt that it showed equipment for living, and we'll talk later about how it helps discover a sense of self. Think of this as a journey that we are going to go on with Carl and Russell, who are the main two characters in the film. The paper is laid out with the introduction first, the literature review, the methodology, the data, the analysis and a discussion, and finally a conclusion. And this is the heart of the matter, how our paper is going to be laid out and how we'll be talking about it. I think one of the main things that struck me about this movie is how layered that this movie was, and the characters. They were not your traditional type of characters, and what I saw within this movie was that the movie Up provides equipment for living by showing the need to continuously search for new layers of identity or self, and how to come to terms with the loss of the old ones. We are constantly changing as human beings, and the main character in this story loses a very large part of his identity and really loses the desire to find a new one and withdraws from life. And I really thought this movie was just a great way of providing that sort of roadmap that Burke talked about, that equipment for living. A good example of that, there's always surprises around the corner in life if you're willing to look for them. One of the things I found so extraordinary about Up is that it weaves these themes of exploration of identity, loss, and love into this one unbroken tapestry, so to speak. And by creating Carl's journey towards the acceptance of this new self, instead of maintaining the old one, and possibly accepting destruction by maintaining the old one. Pixar has really, I think, given viewers a whole different take on this theme of finding a new sense of self. Another thing that I found interesting was Up is not a customary fairy tale at all, or not a traditional child's movie. It addresses issues of aging, issues of loss and deep grief, and sets out to appeal to adults as well as children. Most children's movies do set out to appeal to those both levels, but I just found that Up tended to really connect with adults a lot stronger than other films. And it also offers this roadmap or message of where people can find meaning and guidance, and definitely equipment for living. We're back to the literature review, which I know is difficult for all of us because what we had to do is go in and find what literature supported our idea and what didn't and what wasn't there. Probably one of the articles that I got the most from was from Payne, who further expounded on the idea of rhetoric and talked about how each of us takes our own truth and our own perception from the presentation of a film and apply it to our own circumstance. Each one of us picked these movies because they meant something to us and they had a personal effect on us, which I think aptly proves this point of equipment for living. Let's talk about the methodology and why I chose this movie. I've mentioned a few things before, but one of the things, the biggest reason I chose it is it's a departure from the traditional two young people meet, boy meets girl, they fall in love, and they live happily ever after. And all of us know life isn't like that. And I think we all look for something different. And I found this was very, very different, and that it gave a different message and a different layer to the equipment for living. So what we're going to do is we are going to focus how Kenneth Burke's equipment for living is proved within the movie Up, but we're also going to view it through the prism of the communication identity theory. And the communication identity theory has 4 layers within it. However, we're only going to talk about the 3rd layer, and that's the relational layer and how that will relate to Carl. So how does this story unfold? Well, the story begins with a young Carl who is a big adventurer, and he meets Ellie, who is also a fellow adventurer, and they fall in love and they get married. And this, to me, brings about one of the most beautifully crafted scenes of the film that has no dialogue, and it simply shows the love story of Carl and Ellie and how they get married and how they have this extraordinary love in this ordinary life. And they build their house and they lose a child and obviously find out they're not going to be able to have children, but they continue on and they still dream that adventure is out there. It becomes very sad when Ellie dies, and Carl decides that he at first is going to give up, and he does not wish to find any other type of life without Ellie. But what happens finally is construction comes in, and they're going to force him out of his home and force him into a nursing home. So he decides to go to Paradise Falls, and he was a balloon salesman, so the best way to do that, he attaches approximately 10,000 balloons to his house, and they go up and up to Paradise Falls. However, Carl finds he has a stowaway in the form of Russell. And he has to take him now because he's stuck. Russell's with him in the flying house, and they begin a friendship. And this is the first shift that we see in Carl, where we see some glimmers of him starting to become affectionate towards Russell. And Carl's never been a father or a father figure or dealt with children. So at first he's very gruff and he's very annoyed, but he's also very amused by Russell and tries to help and brings him along on things. Once Carl and Russell land, they're very near Paradise Falls, but not quite there. And they meet Kevin the bird and Russell and Doug the dog, And they form this pseudo-family with which Carl is the head of. And Carl begins to feel security and comfort in this pseudo-family. But along the way, as they're all traveling, they meet Charles Muntz, who is his former idealized hero, but now ultimately becomes his nemesis. Charles Muntz wishes to kill Kevin the bird for scientific reasons. And this brings about one of the big classic good versus evil battles where Russell refuses to lose Kevin and runs off to save him, and Carl has to go after him. And they ultimately end up saving Kevin along with Doug the dog, and they go home, and Carl accepts that he has this new life and that he can continue in his old life and his new life. And we'll talk about that some more in the next paragraph. Our core identity is bound up in the aspect that is most important to us, and yet it is impossible to describe ourselves with just one identity. Little John Foss gives a very good definition of identity, because it is also encompassing identity as a source of motivation and expectation in life and is enduring. It has staying power. But this does not mean that identities, once formed, never change. More accurate is to say that there is a core identity, but identity is also an ongoing and emergent process. Carl's identity did change. He saw himself. If we look at the core of his identity, it was through his relationship with Ellie. He was Ellie's husband. That was the main part of his identity. At the relational level, identity is not strictly individual, but is attached to the relationship itself. But this loss of this identity is very confusing to him, and he's withdrawn from the world. But when Russell enters his life, Russell's joy, enthusiasm, and liking adventure is somewhat reminiscent of Ellie. Carl, who was never a father and is not used to being around children, wants nothing to do with them. But Russell slowly moves Carl into a path that he really does not want to go, that into a friendship and a relationship. When I was analyzing this, I really felt that there were three main shifts for Carl. These identity shifts just don't happen as quickly as they do in the movies by one symbolic act. I felt there were three shifts, and the first shift I felt came when Russell stowed away on the house, and Carl simply couldn't get rid of him, and he had to assume responsibility for this child. I think for each of us, that brings on a feeling of protector, as it did for Carl. And the second shift is when Russell begins talking a lot that he doesn't have a father, that his father's not around. We never find out what happens to Russell's father. He just mentions that he's not there a lot, and that's very sad. Part of this second shift is where a lot of the humor in the movie comes in, with Kevin the bird and Doug the dog. And the best part is Kevin the bird is a girl, but Russell wants to name him Kevin. And the last shift that's the big shift that we see in the movie, where Carl has to decide this is the pinnacle of his journey. Does he want to hold on to his house and Ellie and the past? And if he does that, he'll lose Russell and Kevin. And that's the choice he has to make. At the time, that's the choice. But later on, the choice becomes about bringing a new identity along with that. As I said before, Carl's final choice involves letting go of Ellie and the life that he shared with her. However, he's letting go of the physical house, not necessarily the memories. He realizes he's developed a new aspect of his identity and begun to see himself as a fatherly figure to Russell. And the final shift occurs when he understands he can do both. He can become a friend and a father figure to Russell without losing any memories of Ellie, and he can remain both broken and whole at the same time. As I was reviewing this story and also reading the article by Payne, I noticed that it would be a fair comparison to say that Up is similar to The Wizard of Oz, because both Dorothy and Carl were on journeys of self-identity, and they're struggling with internal ideas of who they are. But the main difference that I found so fascinating was the age of Carl in Up. He's a 78-year-old curmudgeon. And in choosing the elderly character, I think Up gives the viewer a completely different perspective in the ever-evolving search to define who we are. And I think it was really fascinating that in our youth-obsessed society, we see this elderly person as the hero of a story. If I look at this movie from a personal level, again, as I had mentioned before, all of us chose our movies for personal levels, and I just felt so attached to this movie, and that my identity will always encompass many layers. And one of the things that I struggled with tremendously was my husband and I had decided very early on, for many reasons, that we were not going to have children. And I struggled with this for a long time, and I felt like this movie just really made a point to me personally that this couple in the movie did not have children. They were not able to, and yet they went on and they had this wonderful life of adventure together. And it really helped me stop struggling with this issue. I felt like that Carl and Ellie demonstrated that different things work for different people, and for my husband and I, we made the right choice. And so we try to live by the find a new adventure. If you're bored, or if something's not going well, find a new adventure. And it's what we still live by today. And personally, right now, my new adventure is school, is what I'm doing now. So it was really an incredibly helpful film for me. So in conclusion, I would like to say that all humans can relate to the search for self, as we all have various identities and we continue to seek out new ones. This unremitting search for a new identity, a new journey, and a new self is one of the central themes of this movie, and can be echoed in the last gift from Ellie to Carl. And what that gift was, it was a picture book of their marriage together, because she found it this wonderful adventure. And at the very end, she wrote, "Now you have to go find a new adventure." Very touching, very wonderful, but I still think words of wisdom for life. On a final note, I would like to thank 4 wonderful women who read my paper and who played Russell to my Carl and sort of forced me along to do better and gave me wonderful support, and couldn't have done this without them. And those women are Dawn Para, Arwen McCafferty, Jenna Wise, and Tanisha Thomas. And again, thank you so very much, and I hope you go see the movie Up.